Good morning. If you've just joined us, I'm just going to give it another minute because we did have, I think we were expecting about 20 people this morning. So I'm just going to give it another minute to see if anyone else joins us. Okay, it's looking pretty stable, so I might make a start. Looks like we're a nice small group this morning, which is good. So good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Vanna Montgomery. I'm a librarian who works with the faculties of Science and Engineering here at the university. Unfortunately, my colleague Tom wasn't well, so he wasn't able to make it this morning. So I'm sorry, but unfortunately, you're stuck with just me. I'll just mention at the start, the scheduling for this session has been quite generous, so they've allowed up to an hour and a half, I think, but I would be surprised if we are sort of here for that long, unless you have lots and lots of questions, which if you do, that's fantastic. So let's have a look. So the goal of today's session isn't so much for you to intimately understand how individual metrics are calculated, but more to give you an orientation into the basics of sort of what metrics are, the types of the metrics that are available, and how they can be used. So we'll start with the basics of what citation and publication metrics are and why they're both popular and controversial. There are a few ways that you might be looking at using metrics at this point in your career, and we'll look at what those are, some examples of metrics that might be useful for those purposes, and what the major differences between the metrics are. We'll then look at where to find metrics, how to make sure your numbers are as accurate as possible, and how to use metrics responsibly. So we do have slides and content that we're planning on talking through today, but I would also be more than happy for this to be more of a discussion. So I'm very interested in finding out sort of what you already know about metrics and what you're hoping to learn today. So if you do have any questions, please do feel free to unmute and ask, or you can send them through the chat if you like. My colleague Gabby is here today, so if I don't notice any of your questions that come through on the chat, she'll prompt me and let me know. Thanks, Gabby. So yes, please, more than happy for this to be sort of a discussion and a back and forth, especially since we're a nice small number. So before I get started with sort of talking through my slides, did anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask?
I don't have any, not at this stage.
Great, thank you. And also just a note, because this is a common question that comes up, I will send through the slides after the session as well. Okay, so what are metrics? When people refer to metrics in relation to research, there are a couple of things that they could be talking about, but it's most likely that they're referring to what are called bibliometrics or citation metrics, so comparing performance based on citation data. You might have heard of metrics like the Journal Impact Factor and the H-index, for example, but there are a huge number of metrics available, ranging from the very simple, like just the number of citations to an article, to ones that are complex formula that adjust for a range of different factors. So, for example, I've got the formula for the FWCI here, which I will not be explaining today because that mathematical type side of things is definitely not my area of expertise. But yeah, just so you get an idea, some of them are quite simple, whereas some of them are quite complex. Okay. So the use of citation metrics in research assessment has become very common at a range of levels, particularly in STEM disciplines. The data is readily accessible and it avoids some of the issues that are associated with qualitative methods of assessment, like bias and the availability of suitable experts, although they're certainly not free from their own issues themselves. So, for example, some global university rankings, which have become very important to universities as they get quite a lot of attention and help attract students and researchers, are based at least in part on metrics. At a national level, the Excellence in Research for Australia exercise, in which universities' research performance is assessed by the ARC, has in recent years at least used citation metrics in certain disciplines. And at the institutional level, metrics are used to support decisions about recruitment and staffing, as well as to target high-performing staff for support, and in performance management more generally. So some staff might find that they have KPIs or standards that they need to meet that involve metrics in some way. So that's sort of a bit of an overview of how they're used. Metrics have over the years been quite controversial though, and their sort of widespread use has been quite unpopular among some parties. And that's for a few reasons. So there are some inherent limitations of citation metrics, starting with the fact that citations are not necessarily positive in and of themselves. So, for example, some articles are highly cited because they're controversial or are used as an example of something negative. And certainly some extremely highly cited articles have been retracted. So one good example of this that we're probably all familiar with is articles claiming connections between vaccinations and autism. Will generally have very high metrics because they've been discussed a lot, but not necessarily in a positive way. There are also issues with individual metrics that we'll discuss more as we have a look at some examples. But one that's very relevant early on in your career is that metrics tend to favour established researchers more than early career researchers who don't have a significant publishing history behind them. So there are some individual metrics that can be more useful for ECRs, but overall, researchers with strong publications and established citation networks will tend to have better numbers. What's been a bigger issue than those sort of inherent limitations, though, is the misuse of metrics, largely through sort of a lack of awareness. So citation metrics are useful when they're applied appropriately and as they were designed to be used, but unfortunately this hasn't always been what happens. So things have improved as awareness has grown, but some of the major problems with their applications in research assessment have included things like use as an indicator of quality. So as we sort of discussed, metrics are not in themselves an indicator of the quality of a paper or a journal. Poor quality papers can be published in highly regarded journals and can be cited lots of times. But they have been used in this way and have at times been used as a substitute for qualitative forms of research assessment. Another significant issue in the past has been the use of journal metrics to demonstrate the impact of an individual article or author. So this is inappropriate, and it's important that you apply metrics only to what they're intended to measure. Another major issue is that metrics aren't equally relevant for all disciplines. Disciplines outside of STEM in particular tend to be poorly represented by metrics, but even within the sciences, fields of research vary significantly in the rates at which they publish and cite papers, and an appropriate level of care when it comes to this issue hasn't always been taken. Finally, it's very important to remember that metrics are only one lens through which to view publications and research performance. So metrics have at times been used as a standalone measure, but they will only ever provide a limited indicator of the impact of an article, a journal, or an author's body of work. So these are sort of some of the reasons that metrics have been controversial or unpopular. A lot of the progress that's been made towards recognition of these types of issues have been due to movements advocating for the responsible use of metrics. So things like the Leiden Manifesto and the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. And you do see restrictions on the use of metrics in certain situations now. So, for example, organisations like the NHMRC have strict guidelines as to how metrics can be used in the assessment of grant applications. It's at a local level that awareness of responsible use still tends to vary the most. So it is valuable to be aware of whether or not practices that you encounter are sound and something that should be happening. So metrics are definitely still around and they can be a valuable thing for you to use. From an individual perspective and earlier in your career, there are a few ways that they can be useful to you personally. And supporting decisions around strategic publishing is a pretty important one. So obviously the advice of experienced colleagues and supervisors is always extremely valuable when you're making decisions about where you want to submit a paper. But if you're weighing up between different titles or you're not sure if the advice you're being given is quite right for you, you can look at rankings based on journal metrics to see how titles are ranked as one part of your decision making. Predatory publishing is also a huge issue that early career researchers in particular can come up against. So this is where publishers of low quality journals or conferences send out emails to researchers to encourage them to submit articles and subsequently pay an article processing charge for that publication. Editorial and peer review processes can be minimal or completely absent and articles simply put up on a website. And these publishers can be quite aggressive or even fraudulent in giving journals the same name as existing well-regarded journals. It's also not uncommon for researchers, so well-known established researchers, to find out that they've been listed as the editor of one of these journals, when in fact they have nothing to do with the journal. So having a few tools at your disposal to work out whether or not a journal is a publication that you want to be submitting to is a good thing. And you can use journal rankings or metrics as one source of information to help you with doing that kind of evaluation. It's not always foolproof because not all legitimate high quality journals are included in rankings. So for example, very new journals won't necessarily be eligible for metrics or rankings, but it can be one indicator that a publisher is predatory or low quality if a title isn't included in any rankings. We do have a strategic publishing toolkit on the library website that provides a lot more information. It provides some information about predatory publishing, and it also has some details about that process of using journal metrics to support strategic publishing decisions if you're interested in learning a bit more about that. Okay.
Mala, could I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, you mentioned that if they don't have that many these publication metrics, the impact factor, then it could be a predatory journal. But also, as you said, newer journals wouldn't have that much. So are there any other factors how you could distinguish a predatory journal?
So there are a few things. I mean, a great go-to thing to do is always just to ask supervisors and colleagues, so trusted, experienced people who are working in your field. They'll generally sort of be aware of publications that are around that publish papers on your field, so they might have an idea. Having a look at the website is a super basic thing, but it can give you an idea. So it can be tricky with journals because some good quality journals will have some not great websites some of the time, but having a bit of a poke around. So having a look at things like, does the journal have a very clearly well-defined scope? Does it identify who its editors are, and are they reputable? But be aware that sometimes journals just falsely will just Google someone and put their name on. So you might need to do some follow-up and see if those people who have been identified as editors mention that somewhere. Probably the best indicator though would be, does the journal have a very well articulated description of its editorial policies and processes? So a good quality academic journal should always say on its website exactly what type of peer review process it uses and how it makes decisions about whether or not articles are going to be accepted for publication. So that's always a really good thing to check. It's not necessarily foolproof because some of these these publishers, it sort of varies in the extent that they go to, but those would be the sort of pool of things that I would consult.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay, thank you, Gabby, for putting those links up. Okay, so strategic publishing, applications for funding. So metrics can also be used to support applications for things like scholarships and grants for funding. This generally involves using metrics to demonstrate that you have a track record of publishing impactful papers in highly ranked journals. It is extremely important, though, that you're aware of any relevant guidelines around using metrics in applications, because different funders do have different rules and they can be quite strict. So, for example, as I mentioned, the NHMRC only allows the use of certain metrics in certain ways, and that should be clear in their information about the funding schemes, what you can and can't do. Similarly to funding applications, they can also be used in applications for jobs and promotion to demonstrate a successful track record. So here I've taken an example from the selection criteria for an advertisement for a postdoctoral role, where you could potentially use metrics to demonstrate that the journals you're publishing in are leading. Another element that can be introduced with this type of use is benchmarking, where you compare your metrics to those of other researchers to demonstrate your relative impact. This can be tricky, as you need to be very careful that you're comparing like with like for the comparison to be valid. So you need to make sure that the people you're comparing yourself to work in a very similar field and are at a similar career stage, have had a sort of similar career experience. So that is one of the elements of metrics that will probably become useful later in your career. It's also one element that I'd suggest that you contact your librarian about if you're interested in looking at doing some benchmarking. So that's sort of the background for you. What I've got to talk about now is sort of looking at the different type of metrics that are available. Did anyone have any questions about any of that sort of background information, or is there anything that you were hoping to find out that I haven't mentioned before I go on?
Not for me.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I've mentioned in passing a couple of things about different types of metrics. What this next section is an overview of a few different metrics that are available. A lot more than this exist, but these examples are ones that are commonly used or discussed and ones that are more likely to be useful to researchers early on in their career. So here we've got just an indication for you. Metrics can be applied at the 3 different levels. So the article level, the author level, and the journal level. So for article level metrics, 2 examples of really common ones you might come across are the citation count and the FWCI. So these are ones that the examples actually that I mentioned right at the start. Citation count in itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the number of citations that an article has received, either since it was published or within a certain time period. This number is fairly limited in its usefulness, though, because it doesn't tell us anything without a point of comparison. So my paper might have 10 citations, but I don't know if that's high or low without knowing how many citations other papers have. So this need to compare in order to create meaning introduces the big issue in metrics of the need to compare what like with like. As we've mentioned earlier, different disciplines cite at different rates. So 10 citations might be high for an engineering article, say, but it might be low for an oncology paper. If I'm going to use the citation count to prove that my article has attracted a lot of citations, then I need to compare it to other papers from the same field of study that were published at a similar time. The FWCI is an example of a metric that accounts for these needs in itself. So field weighting or field normalization is one way of addressing that issue of comparing like with like. There are quite a few metrics that are field weighted, but the FWCI is an example that's used and recommended very commonly. So it adjusts for the field of study, the publication type, and the time period in which a paper was published or the data was published on. And it compares the number of citations the paper received to the average in those categories. To interpret the FWCI, if your FWCI for a paper is 1, it means that that paper has performed or attracted the number of citations as expected based on those averages. If you've got an FWCI higher than 1, it indicates that it's attracted an above average number of citations. So as long as the person seeing the number understands this, an FWCI is more informative on its own than a number like citation count. So that's one reason that it's quite a popular metric. Okay. So author level metrics. So author level metrics measure the whole pool of an author's articles and citations. This also introduces the element of productivity though. So scholarly output is the most basic example of a productivity metric. It's simply the number of papers an author has published, either throughout their entire career or during a certain time period. Particularly when taken from a whole career perspective, you can see how productivity measures will be much more favourable to established researchers. They have had more time to publish more papers. More established researchers might have more time to spend on research and writing than researchers earlier on in their career, for example. This whole issue can also introduce a level of gender bias, as women are more likely to have career breaks that will affect their productivity, for example. And because of this, it's important that this type of metric is considered relative to opportunity. So relative to what's happened in a person's career, whether they've taken career breaks, that kind of thing. Other metrics combine that productivity measure with a measure of citations. So this is the case for the H-index, which may be the most famous metric, which tends to be the best known author level metric. If you're not familiar with it, it's a whole career measure where to have an H-index of 5, you must have at least 5 papers that have been cited at least 5 times. You don't need to worry too much about intimately understanding individual metrics though. So although the H-index has been very popular and a whole range of variants have been created, it's ultimately only useful for comparing authors who have been publishing in the same field over the same period of time. So another option is the author level FWCI. So very similarly to how it's used at an article level, it makes those similar adjustments, but applies them to an author's total output. So as I kind of mentioned, author level metrics will probably have limited utility earlier in your career. You'll probably find that article level and journal level metrics are going to be more useful to you. Many of these author level metrics are also more complex to generate, as they tend to be found in the analytical extensions of Scopus and Web of Science, which I'll talk about soon. Those extensions are called SciVal and Insights. We won't be looking at SciVal or Insights today, but if after the session you're really interested and you want to have a look at those, we do have a series of videos available that demonstrate it. And I've linked to those at the end of the slides, which I'll send out. Okay. So journal metrics. As I've mentioned, these and particularly the rankings that are produced based on the different metrics can be helpful to identify the journals that attract the most citations in your field. If you are consulting rankings though, it is advisable to check rankings based on a range of different metrics because of the differences in what they take into account, and the position of a journal can change quite radically in rankings when you consult rankings based on different metrics. And you want to avoid being influenced too much by any biases of a particular metric that might be present. So the best known and oldest journal metric is the journal impact factor. This is a term that a lot of people actually use to refer to sort of journal metrics or metrics in general, but journal impact factor does refer to a specific metric or calculation. So it reflects the annual average number of citations to recent articles published in a journal. There have been a lot of issues raised with the GIF, and quite an extensive body of literature exists on it, but ultimately, it is one of those ones that can only be used to compare publications within disciplines, and you want to supplement it with other metrics. So often people will cite it because it is such a well-known metric, but you definitely do want to have a look at other metrics as well, particularly if you're looking at it as part of your decision-making. So other metrics that you might consider are the SCImago Journal Rank, or SJR, which is a metric that adjusts based on a measure of the prestige of a citing journal. That one is also freely available via the SJR website, which is a good thing to be aware of in case you find yourself without access to university library databases at some point. The source normalised impact per paper, which I know as the SNP, compares a journal's performance to the citation potential of the disciplines it covers. So both of these metrics are field weighted, so better for comparing journals across disciplines if that's something you need to do. If you're interested in using journal metrics to demonstrate that the journals you've published in are high impact or leading, you can simply choose the metric which ranks the journal the highest, but you will need to keep in mind that whoever is reading the application that you're using that for might not be familiar with a metric. So if possible, you do want to use a more recognisable metric. Otherwise, it looks a bit like you're trying to you really had to search for some evidence to prove that this is a good journal. And these three metrics are relatively common. Another important reason to be aware of the range of journal metrics, though, is that the journal impact factor is only available for journals indexed in Web of Science, whereas the SJR and the SNP are available for journals indexed in Scopus. So this is an important point with metrics in general, but particularly journal metrics. So Web of Science and Scopus, if you happen to not be familiar with them, are the main sources that produce metrics. And it's important to understand sort of the various implications of the fact that some of these are found in one database and some of these are found in another. So, any questions about any of that? Oh, there's a chat message. Okay, so the FWCI you will find in Scopus, which we'll go through and have a look at almost now. Actually, I think that's almost exactly what I'm going to do now. Any other questions before we go in and have a look at these?
Just a quick question, sorry, Vanna. Could you just say again which sort of acronym goes with which database?
Oh, right. I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about remembering each, because once you start having a look at them, it'll be quite apparent. But so the GIF, or the Journal Impact Factor, belongs to Web of Science, and the SJR and the SNP belong to Scopus, off the top of my head.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries. Okay. No, don't apologise. Oh, that's a that's a so predatory journals, it's quite it can be a bit of grey area. I would be surprised if a journal that's indexed in Scopus or Web of Science is genuinely a predatory publisher, because journals need to meet certain quality criteria that are specified by the databases in order to be indexed in those sources. And I mean, journals do sort of that are indexed can vary in quality on certain factors, there has sort of been controversy around, I mean, in the past, people have published lists of journals that they've identified as predatory, for example, and some of that's been quite hotly disputed because, not all of these journals that have been identified as predatory are necessarily these sort of almost out and out scams where they're just trying to take people's money and are being fraudulent in identifying their editors, for example. So some of these may be journals that are genuinely being run by academics, but perhaps their editorial processes might not be as thorough as another journal's, for example. So it's not necessarily a clear cut distinction. So there have been times when journals have been identified as predatory, and then the publishers of that journal have gone, hey, no, and people who have published in that journal have gone and come out and said, no, we are not predatory, that's not us. Generally, I'd say that inclusion in Scopus or Web of Science is a pretty good indicator that it's not a predatory publisher, because it will have had to meet those criteria to be included. I hope that makes sense. No worries. Okay, so the three main sources of metrics, so including the article, author, and journal level, are so Scopus and Web of Science, which I'm guessing you're probably all familiar with. They're both large multidisciplinary databases, and additionally Google Scholar, which provides a very limited number of metrics. So some metrics, as I've kind of already alluded to, some metrics will be available from only one of these sources, and others are available from all of them, particularly your basic metrics like citation count. Where a metric is available from multiple sources, you'll find that the number that's identified for a particular author or article will vary. So this is because the sources all index different publications. So while Scopus and Web of Science are very similar products and there's a lot of crossover in the publications they include, their coverage isn't identical. So depending on your field of study, you may find that your numbers are higher in either Scopus or Web of Science, and they'll probably be highest across the board in general in Google Scholar. Generally speaking, if you're using a metric for an application, you'd select the most suitable metric, and if it's available from more than one source, then select the source that gives you the highest number and cite where you got it from. The general exception to this, though, is Google Scholar. So it's broadly acknowledged that Google Scholar data lacks reliability. People are very keen a lot of the time to cite Google Scholar numbers because they're so much higher than the ones they get from the databases, but issues with duplication and misattribution are very common, and citations are even subject to spamming. So for example, sometimes, particularly with an author who has a lot of publications, a lot of citations, we have found in the past that sometimes you'll click on a citation within Google Scholar and it'll actually direct you to a site selling bags or something like that. So it is possible for these things to be spams. So because of that generally sort of acknowledged lack of reliability, Scopus and Web of Science are the preferred sources for metrics, particularly in STEM disciplines where they tend to have good coverage. Okay, so let's have a look. Hopefully my screen sharing holds up. Okay. So this is Scopus. Can everybody see Scopus?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So again, guessing you're all quite familiar with Scopus. It is a very large multidisciplinary database. If you are looking for metrics in here, the best way to start is by searching for your author profile. So I'm going to use an example author who hopefully no one is familiar with, called Jeff Bird. So last name, first name. Okay. And we encounter our first issue. So metrics, author level metrics in particular in these databases are based on author profiles that at least initially are algorithmically generated. So you can see most of the time there will generally be more than one person with the same name. So you'll need to go through and identify which of these is my Jeff Bird. So I'm looking for Jeff Bird of the University of Oxford. It can be, though, particularly as there are issues with things like your name will be listed differently in different journals. Sometimes it will include a middle name or a middle initial. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes people change their names or their surname. So it's quite common to find that you will actually have more than one author profile in Scopus. And sometimes you'll even find that your articles have been associated with another author profile that doesn't belong to you. Don't panic, you can fix it. So for example, if I were to find that all of these profiles were actually me, I could request to merge them. So if you do want to make changes to a profile, so I'm just going to go into Jeff Bird because I know that this is my Jeff Bird. You just need to, so there's an edit profile button here. So you just need to have a Scopus personal account and be logged into your account. And then you can go through and follow the prompts. So you can change things like your the main name at the top of the profile. Sometimes an affiliation will be outdated, and you can correct the articles that are associated with that profile. But it's quite a user-friendly, intuitive, the word I'm looking for, process to do that. It is important to check in and make sure you have corrected your profile at least sort of semi-regularly, because if, well, for one thing, people could be going to look at this profile just to have a look and get an idea of who you are as a researcher. So things like current affiliation could be important from that perspective. But if the articles, the documents that are associated with your profile are incorrect, then the metrics it generates are going to be incorrect. So that's a good starting place, checking that your author profile is correct. One way that you can claim your profile, and help deal with any issues of multiple names. So for example, if you've gotten married and then changed your name, you might have published under very different names. And also to help with issues of Scopus automatically generating more profiles for you, is to connect your ORCID ID to your author profile. So if you're not familiar with ORCID, it is a researcher profile that gives you a unique ID number. So Jeff Bird has connected his ORCID profile to his Scopus profile. You can see it here. If he hadn't, there would be a button here saying connect your ORCID profile to your ORCID to this profile. So I'll show you what it looks like. So if you're going to sign up for any researcher profiles, we would recommend that ORCID be the one that you choose. So it is a non-proprietary thing. It's not a commercial product. It's supported by research institutions. You have complete control over it. So it sort of functions kind of similar to like a LinkedIn sort of thing. So you can list your employment and your education and qualifications and all of your publications. It also lets you list any names that you're known by. So, for example, Jeffrey Bird is also known as Jeff Bird. And you can provide any other links that you like. Publishers, funders, and other groups are increasingly requiring that researchers have an ORCID, and, for example, that they submit it when they publish with a journal. And universities are also definitely strongly encouraging researchers to have one of these, because it's so helpful as a point of verification. So you can come here and say, okay, yes, these different publications with the different names associated with them are indeed this person. You can control who sees it, so you can make your profile completely private. It's just not going to be terribly useful for someone who is trying to use it for those purposes of disambiguation. It's free, and I would definitely recommend it. Okay, so connecting that ORCID profile, once you have one, to your Scopus author profile will also hopefully stop. So if you have provided your ORCID number when you publish an article, and then your ORCID is associated with this profile, then Scopus should know that that's where this article belongs, and it can stop it from splitting out and creating new profiles, which does sometimes happen. I apologize if that was a bit confusing. Let me know if you have any questions. But so this is the author profile. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, yes, if you haven't already, and yeah, this only having one name is an issue I have come across before, although not in relation to Scopus author profiles, because the issue you may have is that even Scopus, even if it lets you nominate your name, it may still sort of demand two names. But in terms of merging them, if you haven't already, you could come here, do your search and identify that these are the profiles. You can merge them. Yeah. So it's not, there's nothing foolproof, unfortunately. You can connect your ORCID to it, but a journal won't necessarily include, even if you have given them your ORCID number, a journal. So it might not, yeah, it might not come through to Scopus as part of the metadata. So unfortunately, the answer is that there's nothing foolproof. So people do sort of have to occasionally, like maybe once a year or something, come back in and do that check. And if publications have been separated out, then you just have to merge them with your main profile. The ORCID is probably the best thing you can do, but unfortunately, yeah, we find sometimes even if the name and the affiliation, all the details will match, and still Scopus will separate it out into another profile for some reason. Sometimes you'll find that it's corrected over time, but it does to a certain extent do things automatically in a way that it's hard to see the reasoning behind. So, yeah, unfortunately, you probably will just need to occasionally check back and correct it, unless their systems improve over time, which would be fabulous. So, sorry about that. Okay, so, but in terms of getting our metrics, so we can see Jeff Bird, we've got a bit of an overview at the top. He's got 178 publications. He is not an HDR student or an early career researcher. And his H index is 56, and he's got over 10,000 citations. You can do a little bit more of an in-depth analysis in terms of if you click citation overview under that graph there. That does allow you to do a couple of things like look at a particular date range or include self-citations. Occasionally, so sometimes when we do reports for people, we'll include that number excluding the self-citations. It's probably more of a bit of a point of interest though, because of course, self-citation is a legitimate academic practice, but it does allow you to do that. So there's sort of some limited author level metrics that you can get in Scopus. Underneath here, though, we can have a look at the individual article level metrics. So you have your citations, your citation count, which is a very basic one. Or if we click through, actually, I might sort by highest cited. So this is the article record, and you can see, so it's got 457 citations. And you can also see that that places it in the 99th percentile. So that's a benchmarking percentile. So it's compared to articles in a similar subject area. It places it in the 99th percentile. So that's quite a nice metric to use as well. And you can see we've got that FWCI. So 9.95 is high. Remembering that 1 would indicate that it's performed at the average for similar documents. So this is definitely a relatively impactful article. There are a couple of things to be aware of when you see that an article is high impact. So things that can influence metrics are things like the number of authors of a publication. There's a particular word for publications that have huge numbers of authors, but it's failing to come to me right now. But articles that have huge numbers of authors tend to have higher metrics, and certain study types tend to attract a lot of citations. Particularly when you're looking at an author who has a small number of publications, if you then put one really high impact article back into a pool, that's going to have a big impact on the author level metrics. So sometimes an author will have 9 papers with an FWCI of 1. If you then add the one with an FWCI of 10 back in, it'll have a big impact on that as a pool. So there are a couple of things like that sort of to be aware of when you're using these, but you don't need to lose sleep over it at this point. Okay. I'll just point out, so it is the view all metrics button. A lot of these, so we're talking today about citation metrics, which are these ones. When you're in these databases, they'll also provide what we call alt metrics. So they're things like the number of times people have viewed the record, if something's been mentioned on social media or in the news. So they are sometimes used. They tend to not be as highly used as citation metrics, though. There is information on those on our website, so you can look into that if you're interested in learning a bit more about them, but I'm not going to go into them today, just so that you're aware that that's what those are if you click on those button. Thank you. Yes, hyper authorship was the word that I was trying to think of in relation to articles with lots of authors. Thank you for that. Okay, so those are our article level metrics. Actually, I should have left that open because in the record, you'll see that the journal title is hyperlinked. So if I click on this, it will give me a few metrics relating to that journal. So the journal Brain has, okay, when you're in Scopus, the metric that will sort of be the most highlighted for journals is called the site score. So the site score is a metric that has been produced by Elsevier, which, if you're not familiar, is the publisher of Scopus, and they also publish a lot of journals. They are transparent about the methodology of how those metrics are calculated. I suppose I'm innately slightly skeptical about metrics that have been produced by journal publishers, because the cynic in me thinks that they're not going to produce a metrics that will reflect poorly on the journals that they publish, but it is a transparent metric. So if you'd like to use that metric, it should be perfectly legitimate. But yes, that is certainly why the site score is so prominent within Scopus. It's because it's Elsevier's metric. And that's the one that a lot of the ranking information will be provided based on. So down here, remember I said rankings tend to be a lot more informative than individual numbers. So we can see this journal has a site score of 19.7, an SJR of 4.573, and a SNP of 3.403. What does that mean? Does that mean that it's really high impact? I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to compare it to other journals. So this ranking information tends to be a lot more useful. So journals within Scopus and Web of Science will be assigned to a particular subject area, and Brain is assigned to general medicine. So within general medicine journals, there are 826 of them in Scopus, and this is ranked number 16. So that's pretty high, and it's at the 98th percentile. Quartile is one that tends to be used quite often. So quartile, obviously, it's whether they're in the top 25%, the next 25% or after. So Q1 journal is in the top. So all this information is much more informative on its own than the raw numbers. So those are the ones that you would tend to use if you were describing a journal demonstrating that it is high impact. If you were writing about your works, it's much more instructive to say that it's in the 98th percentile than it's got a site score of 19.7. Okay, so that's how you can access the information about the journals that you've published in. If you're trying to decide where to publish and you'd like a bit of extra information to help with that, you can compare journals in a field in the sources section of Scopus. So it's usually linked up the top. And what you can do is you can search by a subject area. I believe Jeff Bird. Behavioral science. So if I wanted to see what the highest ranked journals are in behavioral science, I can come through. So automatically it's sorted by site score. So by site score, Nature Human Behavior is the top journal article. But I'd want to have a look at how it ranks based on some other metrics as well. So if I come through and I change it to sort by SNP, Nature Human Behavior, still the top ranked. Oh, sorry. I forgot. If it has changed. No. Or you can have a look by SJR. And again, it's still Nature Human Behavior. So you can see the rankings do change as you go through the different metrics. So to get a bit more of a balanced view, it is good to have a look at how that changes. That's basically Scopus. Any questions about any of that? Anything else you were hoping to find out? Oh, excellent. Okay. So that's Scopus. The other major source, as we've discussed, is Web of Science. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because Scopus and Web of Science are such similar products, but again, just shout out and stop me if you'd like to look at something. So we need to go to researchers. I'm going to Jeff Bird and I'm going to search. Okay, and you can see we've got two profiles for Jeff Bird. They're both from the University of Oxford and the Department of Experimental Psychology. So it is likely that Jeff Bird's works have been split into two. So he might want to combine those records. One thing that's quite important to note in Web of Science, you'll see that there's a green tick against this profile. that means that Jeff Bird has come in and claimed this profile. If it hadn't, this button here would say claim profile. The important implication of that is that if you've claimed your profile, only you can then edit it. So in Scopus, or if a profile hasn't been claimed in Web of Science, if you're having issues with it and you want some help making edits, we librarians can go in and request changes on your behalf. But in Web of Science, if you have claimed your record, we won't be able to do that for you. So that's just something that's for you to be aware of. It does provide a level of verification of what's in that profile though. So very similar, we've got a few author level metrics over here, 138 publications, whereas he had 178 in Scopus. That kind of change is definitely not unusual. And 55 here versus 56 in Scopus. If we click through to look at the publications, Web of Science only at the article level, you'll only be able to get the citation count or the number of citations. So for example, this paper has been cited 5 times. That's the only article level metric that you'll find in Web of Science. Again, you can click on the journal title and it will give you the journal impact factor. So Web of Science is JIF, and it will give you a bit of contextualizing information. So amongst clinical psychology journals, it's a Q3, which is a bit less than ideal. When we're talking about metrics, we can sort of get into metrics mode and go, oh, Q3, not that great. But obviously, all of this needs to be contextualized when it comes to publishing. So there may be very good reasons for publishing an article in a journal that isn't as highly ranked. It may be the best fit for the subject that you're writing about. It may be where people working in that field read. So metrics are only ever one part of the decision making or the evaluation process. It's really important to always combine it with other information. But we librarians sometimes can get into metrics mode. But we do have that in the back of our minds, I assure you. So Q3, and it's ranked 73 out of 131. So again, we've got that nice contextualized information. I would tend to use the journal impact factor metrics versus the journal citation indicator, which is also available now because they are better known. So that's your journal level metrics for where you've published. In Web of Science, if you want to do that comparison, that viewing of the rankings, then you do need to sort of exit. You need to go to products and it's journal citation reports. Hopefully it doesn't make me log in or anything again. Okay, so once I'm in journal citation reports, if I go to journals, I can view categories. Going to go to psychiatry, psychology, behavioral sciences. And again, so there are different indicators. SCIE, I believe, tends to be the more established, whereas ESCI is emerging science. So that would be why there's a lot lower number in this category, but I'm going to go to the SCIE edition. And very similarly, you can then sort by the different metrics. You can, if you go to customize, you'll see there's a whole range of metrics available that you can then add in and sort things by. So you'll see there's things like the eigenfactor, which off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you about. we do tend to stick to this smaller pool of metrics, some of them partly because they're well known, others because they're effective measures. So we don't tend to go for the sort of slightly random things that people tend to be less familiar with, like the eigenfactor. But you can add in things like Jeff rank. And then very similarly, you can have a look at how it affects that. So that is Web of Science. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Did anyone have any questions about any of that? Great, excuse me, sorry about that. Okay, so the last one I'm just going to have a very quick look at is our third one, which is Google Scholar, which only has a few things, but it really sort of demonstrates the differences. So Scopus had the higher number of publications for Jeff Bird, and that was 178. To see how many publications in Google Scholar, it's quite annoying. You have to scroll down to the bottom eternally. I wish I could see my sidebar. And click show more. So he's got 257. So that's significantly more articles in Google Scholar. So you would partly that's because of just the greater coverage. We mentioned earlier that journals need to meet those certain criteria to be included in Scopus and or Web of Science. Google Scholar does not have those criteria. It's simply anything that's been identified as academic will be included. So that greater coverage means that generally more of an author's publications will be included in Google Scholar. But sometimes there will be issues with things like misattribution. So you may want to check that they are actually all your articles. And I'm sorry, my screen share is stopping me from not scrolling. Okay. And then you'll just have very basic. So for example, 18,603 citations and your H index of 71, significantly higher than that 55 or 56. But that could be because of issues of misattribution, duplication, or things like spamming. The I10 index is another one of those sort of spin-off metrics that people tend not to use so much, but it is included in Google Scholar. But I think that demonstrates pretty well, one, why people are often very keen to use Google Scholar metrics, but also how that sort of quality control within Scopus and Web of Science influences things. But those are the three major sources that we use when we are finding metrics. Any questions about any of that? Anything else you'd like to look at before I go and talk about a couple of more things before we wrap up? Nope. Okay. So, what are you referring to when you say publish or perish? Yeah. Sorry, I was just going because I will say, I'm sorry, but vaguely aware that it is a resource, but also publish or perish sort of refers to that general culture of, you need to be publishing a lot. So that's why I asked. And I don't know. So I have to apologize. Unfortunately, I'm not really familiar. Publish or perish isn't something that I use a lot. So I'm not actually familiar with sort of what type of content you'll get on there. In general, I'd say, do you mean in terms of getting information and selecting a journal to publish in? That's okay. I mean, I've been aware or looked at it quite a lot. So it's a software program that analyzes academics. So there are sort of I think there are a couple of sort of similar things out there as well, where people have created alternative spaces that collect information and produce this kind of thing. And my colleagues just said that they believe it's recommended to sometimes to people in social sciences and arts disciplines. But I think there are a few of these similar sort of things out there that try and collect citation information about journals and produce citation information metrics that are external because of sort of issues. If it's recommended for people in the arts, that may well be because Scopus and Web of Science tend to have better coverage of the sciences than the arts. So I mean, the reason that today's session is called metrics in STEM is because metrics tend to relate to journal article metrics. So yeah, no, that's fine. It's good to have a discussion. So people in, for example, disciplines like history, where they mainly produce books, their output impact won't be particularly well represented by these measures. So it may be that particular publish or perish is trying to solve some of those issues for people in the arts. Unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head. I would say the advantage of using Scopus and Web of Science, at least when it comes to using the metrics as supporting evidence and things like applications, is that people broadly tend to be familiar with them and they tend to know that they're, sort of fairly authoritative, reliable sources. And you should be citing where you get metrics data from. Good practice, which I think I'm about to talk about with metrics, is that people should know where you got your numbers and that it is a relatively objective number. So I would say that that's an advantage when it comes to using Scopus or Web of Science. I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I haven't looked at Publish or Perish in quite some time. No worries. Okay. So hopefully you can see that. So we've looked at how you can find metrics in the different sources. Okay, again, we talked about this, but in terms of what you can do to hopefully help with your issues of correct profiles, is going in, manually correcting any profiles, any issues with your profiles that are out there, and use that, sign up for an ORCID, use it when you publish. Hopefully the publisher will send it through as part of the metadata for the article, and connect your ORCID ID to your Scopus author profile and your Web of Science author profile as well. It is probably the single biggest thing you can do to help with profile consistency, although it's not perfect. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is sort of mentioning a few key things to remember when you're using metrics, because as I sort of laboured fairly heavily earlier, people haven't always been particularly scrupulous with making sure that they're using metrics appropriately or meaningfully. So when you're using metrics, choose the metrics that's most suitable for what you're trying to demonstrate. So if you're trying to demonstrate that you've published in high impact journals, choose a journal metric. If there are multiple metrics that could work for what you're saying, choose the one that makes you look the best by all means, but do keep in mind that if the person reading your application has never heard of a metric, it could be a bit more of a negative. Choose whichever of Scopus or Web of Science has the highest numbers, but cite where you got the numbers from and from what date. These numbers do change very regularly. So just providing where you got it from, the date that you pulled it, is good practice that we recommend people always do. And finally, provide some context when you present metrics. So although many people are familiar with the more common metrics, a lot of people aren't necessarily so familiar. So a brief explanation will always be beneficial. So this can be something like the two examples here. So with an FWCI of 3.10, citing our source, this paper has been cited more than 3 times the global average for similar papers. Or I've published in this journal and this journal, which both have journal impact factors placing in the top 10% of behavioral sciences journals. So making it meaningful for the people who are reading it in case they don't understand just what a straight FWCI means, for example. So that's all sort of the content that I had to talk to you about today. We do have a few resources that are available to you. So I mentioned that strategic publishing toolkit, which has a few pages that relate specifically to metrics, and also a page that talks about predatory publishing. When you're in Scopus, if you go through to the help section, Elsevier has a research metrics handbook, which talks about all of the metrics that are found in Scopus and SciVal in quite a lot of detail, including how they should and shouldn't be used. A good one to keep in mind if you find yourself between positions without access to subscription databases is that the SJR website is freely available. And finally, if you want to go in and have a look at doing more detailed analysis and producing more metrics, and they're available in Scopus, we have some training videos on SciVal, which is that analytical extension of Scopus that you can refer to if you want to go through and start having an explore of those. But other than that, also keep in mind that HDR students can always book an appointment with a librarian. So if there's something you wanted to discuss, or if you want to look at doing a benchmarking exercise, for example, you're welcome to book an appointment with us to do that. Or you can always send us an email as well. That's all under Contact a Librarian on our website. But other than that, please, any more questions that you have? But other than that, thank you for coming, and I hope it's been useful. Oh, thank you, Gabby, for sending those links through. Thank you. you.